Hi, I'm Ann Driscoll, and I'm happy to be hosting this segment of the Gloucester Writers Center Right Way Up Conversations with Writers. And this week, I'm going to be talking with Margo Shea. The conversation I'm having with Margo is about her new book. It's called Derry City, Memory and Political Struggle in Northern Ireland. And I'm really excited about this book because Margo has approached the historical conflict in Northern Ireland from a different perspective, and that being using memory as a kind of play stop to examine how the past affects the present. And I'm also really happy to connect with Margo because we both have a very deep love of Ireland, having both spent some time living there, me in the south and she in the north. So I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And first, Margo, I really want to congratulate you on your book, Derry City. It notably has been published, and I think you were very excited about this, by the esteemed University of Notre Dame Press. I found it to be a very compelling historical narrative of, a community in transition with a particular focus on Derry. I'm curious about how was your book received in Derry and in Northern Ireland and even in the US, especially given the fact that, you're an American visiting, living, recording, writing.
Hi, Anne. It's so fun to be with you, and I consider it absolutely an honor to do an interview with you. I sat on the board of Voices Against Injustice, which used to be the Salem Award Foundation, which awarded you with their annual Salem Award a few years ago. As for your question, how is my book being received? I think it's a slow burn. My friends in Derry are proud of me and over the moon, and I think they are also sort of gratified that after me knocking around Derry for almost 2 decades, that I finally have something to show for that. I think that anytime an outsider writes a history of a place that's not their own, there's going to be a little bit of skepticism and I think it takes a little bit of time. So I'm still kind of waiting for the official word of what folks think, but I can say that I've gotten some really lovely messages and emails, especially from people whose family and neighbors show up in the book.
Well, that actually was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because there was that message you shared with me, the email from the son of someone whose memories about the Battle of the Bogside was included in the book, and that seemed to really resonate for you. Tell me about that.
I think my book has, it reflects an effort on my part to situate ordinary people in an extraordinary historical moment,
right,
and to really kind of focus in on the ways that ordinary people's ways of living, of being in community, of thinking collectively, of seeing themselves as sort of joined together for better or worse. That was a story that I really wanted to tell. And it wasn't the story I thought I was going to tell in the beginning, but as the narrative started to take form and I could sense the ways that memory played into these larger historical issues and events, it seemed really worth it to me to kind of tease out the ways that people's way of living fit into the larger historical events. So the email that I sent you was from Dermot Quinn, who's a friend of mine, and his dad, Michael Quinn, ran a pharmacy in the Bogside for something like 30 years. And so the point that I was making in the book about the Battle of the Bogside is that, yes, it was a cataclysmic moment of rupture, but at the same time, it drew on and reflected the kinds of relationships and the kinds of sort of ways of being neighborly that had been in practice for decades in the Bogside. And so Michael Quinn's memories about how on Fridays someone would bring them tripe soup, and on Tuesdays, you know, so-and-so would come by with a thermos of tea, and all of these things that made the pharmacy way more than a pharmacy.
Right.
It made the pharmacy a center of community life, seemed really important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that email came, it was two things. One is that those things were important, period.
Right.
And for, I think, anyone to see their loved ones reflected in the story was important or significant. And two, I think that maybe as Americans and the kinds of historical consciousness that we have, I think we often tend to think of historical actors as larger than life, right? As sort of superheroes of the past. And for me, Derry was just peopled with historical actors who made a difference. And so to have an academic book that shed some light on the ways in which people make history, and the ways in which ordinary people doing what kind of look like ordinary things are actually part of making history and changing history. It seemed really, you know, it tied together a bunch of things that I wanted to do, and that's why it was gratifying to sort of get the shout out and the delight of seeing one's dad reflected in the pages of my book.
Well, I think that that's one of the things that really resonated about your book for me is I'm very much interested in story. And, you know, both as a social worker in my previous life and as a journalist in my current life. But for the same reason, it's, you know, I'm not surprised that he reached out to you in that way, because that's what we all want, is our stories to be told, our stories to be heard. And so, and that's what I love about your approach to history, is that in many ways it's, you know, it's very personal. It's down to tripe soup on a Friday or whatever. So I think that that's really valuable and really important. And also, as you've already pointed out, it's the history that we don't necessarily hear, or you know, it's not the usual way for history to be told, but it very much is important. But I'd like to go back to sort of how your interest started. And I think you were a teen when you read a book called Reading in the Dark. And it's a novel centered on the coming of age story of a boy, a poor Catholic boy growing up in Derry, written by Shea. And it was that book, I think, that made you want to go to Derry. And I'm curious about, you know, when you were reading this book, how the Derry that you actually got introduced to differed from what you read in that book. If your expectations were matched up, or were they very different, or how that sort of impacted the rest of the way your life unfolded?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a little bit older. My first trip to Northern Ireland was when I was a teenager, but I happened upon Reading in the Dark probably an hour before I was going on vacation. And the vacation, it seems like a dream now, pre-COVID, but it involved flying to New Mexico. And so I knew I was going to have a long flight, and I stopped by the library on my way out of town, and they had a few new books right at the front, and I just kind of picked one up, and I was like, Ireland, intimacy, detective story, great, grabbed it, and off I went. And I didn't realize that book would actually sort of change my life, because I still credit it, all these years later, I still credit it with compelling me to want to go to Derry and then making that happen. So if you haven't read the book, read the book. It's fantastic. And what's really notable to me about this book is that Shea refuses to say whether it's a novel or a memoir. And if anyone knows Northern Ireland at all, you'll know that if people don't want to answer a question, they just will pretend they didn't hear it, right? It's really important not to, I mean, it's kind of funny because we think of Northern Ireland as this space of conflict, but I've actually never met people in social situations who are as conflict averse, right? So being polite.
It's very true. I can
And being
understand that.
kind, right?
Yeah.
Those are the things like that really came front. So Dean's playing between fact and fiction and memory by itself is fascinating to me. There's things about the story. The story creates a city where the past lives in the present and never ever really goes away. You could sort of say it's as simple as the sins of the fathers and how the sins of the fathers are begot upon their sons.
Right.
But I think that it's more than that. And it's a place where everyone sort of knows everything, but they don't have all of the pieces of information.
Interesting.
And that is fascinating. It's also a place where your relationships are active, right? Community is like a verb. People do it all the time, whether you like it or not. I said it in another talk about my book that in Derry, life is with people, even if they're driving you around the bend. And that was the Derry that I discovered. And
Is that the Derry you fell in love with?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm split between being an introvert and being an extrovert. And sometimes in Derry, people they would be really surprised that I would want to spend an evening in alone reading a book or watching TV. Especially when I was there as someone in my 20s, it was as if there was something really wrong with me that I didn't want to be with people, because the general norm is you're with people and life is with people. Right. And if you're not with people, then what are you doing?
Right.
But I did also connect to Seamus Dean's narrator in Reading in the Dark, who would literally crawl into bed in a room that he shared with a bunch of siblings, and grab like an old camping lantern and put it under his blanket and sort of escape from Derry and escape from Northern Ireland and escape from his family through fiction and through adventures.
People often describe Northern Ireland in terms of political terms or religious terms. You arrived in 98, so before me. What, as this war is ending and peace is in the works, what part of history and memory do you think did it play in, kind of picking up the pieces of what's left?
I remember reading an article once about someone it was a women's writers group. So there was a writers group and there was an academic reflecting on sort of this writers group, but there was a woman and she had left her children alone in front of the telly just to run down the block and get something, and she was going to come right back, and she came back and there was an army jeep outside the flats, and she walked into the house and one of the soldiers' weapons was leaning up against the hallway door, and she just, it's all this panic and sort of what is happening inside my house and what are these people doing inside my house. And she turned and, there were two soldiers on the sofa with the kids watching Little House on the Prairie. And these sort of, the quotidian and the terrible were so intertwined.
But that was life. That was life, that, it was completely unpredictable and completely terrifying and completely mundane all at the same time.
I mean, I think 1998, after the Oma bombing, and right after the peace agreement was signed, what I always kind of think is that it was a really tender time. It was like a soft underbelly of an historical moment. I kind of miss the days before podcasts and streaming everything, because I listened to the radio obsessively, and I listened to Radio Foil which was the Derry BBC affiliate,
Hmm.
like for hours every day. And I still remember at 7:59 a.m. for 1 minute every day that year, someone from Northern Ireland would come on the radio with just a 60-second story about the Troubles. They would just stop you in your tracks. And it was, academics, like especially people like me, I talk about history and memory, and we would use big words like multivocal, it just means many voices. But that segment every day, a different person, a different age, a different background, a different identification with a sectarian, identity or not, an
Right.
identity that sort of exploded the categories and sort of, rendered the categories false. I also remember in the late 90s, there wasn't only the peace agreement and the post-OMA kind of desire to make the peace last. There was also European Union funding for
Right.
places like Derry that were kind of struggling from like all manner of financial deprivation.
Hmm.
And so the thing that really struck me about the city at that moment was that creativity was unleashed. And every night of the week in Derry, I used to think like I couldn't really live anywhere that's this small, that's this walkable, that's this kind of close knit, and still have a talk, a workshop, a poetry reading, an improv theater performance every night of the week, right?
Isn't that amazing?
So I think that when I came to Derry, it was not as a student, and I spent a lot of my free time with writers and storytellers and local historians. And I really learned the history of the city and the stories of the city through those voices.
Hmm.
And as I kind of became more interested in Irish history and memory, and the ways that memory has always been seen as divisive and as a real problem in the context of Northern Ireland,
Right.
it really struck me that the people and Derry's, specifically Derry's kind of local past keepers, didn't seem to show up so much in the
Right.
record, right? Like Jonathan Barden wrote this amazing history of Ulster, and it's like 1,000,000 pages long. And Marianne Elliott wrote this phenomenal book called The Catholics of Ulster, and it's probably like close to 1,000 pages long.
Mhm.
And both of those books, right, you get to 1921 with partition and the establishment of the state of Northern Ireland. And it's like the chapters are tiny, right? They're really small. They're just like really small. It's like, well, this happened and everyone sort of held their breath because then this other thing happened called the Troubles. And let's all talk about that. And I felt like the history before the Troubles was interwoven into so much story and so much sense of place. And yet, whenever I would try to find out more about it, I would find myself kind of stuck, digging through information, but not really finding stuff that seemed to reflect
Right.
the people I knew, the streets, the churches, the activities. So that's one of the things that sort of pushed me towards this project.
One of the things that's really stuck with me when we were chatting before was that, you sort of became interested in the physical manifestations of marking history, like with statues or whatever. But in particular, there was the statue you found in the city cemetery in Derry that was dedicated to everyone from Derry who had died during the famine time. Tell me more about, how people create their own kind of traditions to solidify the history or acknowledge the history or manifest the history in some way.
When we think about monuments and memorials, we often think about things that are sort of iconic, right? The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. It's as if we want to place something in the landscape and project onto it a lot of values and a lot of lessons for the future, right? A monument is never just a monument. It's always just as much about the present and the future as it is about the past. As we're seeing, as we're going through this process of editing our memorial landscapes here in the U.S. and determining which monuments really speak for the people we are and the society we want to be. Right. And so when I looked around Derry or Londonderry, the physical memorial landscape was really kind of reflective of the city as a plantation city, the city as a 17th century representation of English colonial might and promise and a kind of sense of progress. And so there's the walls themselves, and there's these amazing keystones, right, of these figures of the gods of the River Foyle and the River Boyne. There's all this memorialization of the siege of Derry, and it's all, seen as absolutely celebratory, but also cautionary, right? This is a city that had grappled with religious difference, political difference, a splitting of loyalties that date all the way back to the 16th century, 17th century. So I guess I just found it curious that in the absence of these kind of concretized spaces where the past is inscribed and it's not going anywhere, Catholics and nationalists in Derry seem to have other means and modes of telling their stories and keeping their stories alive, right? And part of it is like, there's the whole thing about inside and outside, like if you're inside a cultural group and looking out, or if you're outside that cultural group looking in. So I think some of that was going on. Derry Catholics didn't have political power. Right. They had a kind of one moment in 1920.
Even though they were a majority,
they were a majority since 1850. Yeah.
It's quite amazing.
So I think that, the monument to the workhouse, the people who died in the workhouse during the famine, I thought it was really significant that Mary Bradley and the other women in the Women's Caucus of the Derry City Council, that was in the mid-1990s, decided they wanted to make that memorial solid and permanent, right? That's what we think of when we think of memorials. And that's why it's kind of like, these tutorials online right now about how to take down a 50-foot memorial are sort of fascinating, because you don't think that they're supposed to come down. And you certainly don't think that a bunch of people tugging and tilting are going to pull it down. But I think the thing for me is that there were all these other ways of telling stories about the past, of remembering the past. Everything, my book kind of goes into all these like little segues, right? About the guy who would take handfuls, armfuls of gorse and put gorse on everyone's doorstep in the Bogside for the 1st of May, right? And then there's the Derry Feis. And the Derry Feis it's not just a performance, because you prepare for the Feis all year long. Yeah. And you're learning the dances, and you're learning the Gaelic poetry, and you're engaging in drama. You're also sort of re-engaging in what people did before you, right? There's different pathways to the past. And I guess the thing that strikes me so much, if you know Derry, you know you are entering free Derry sign, right, on the gable door on the Lecky Road. So it came as a huge shock to me that corner before urban redevelopment, which occurred sort of the same time as the outbreak of the Troubles, which itself is a fascinating story. But Fox's Corner was at that corner, and Fox's Corner was considered to be the heart of the Bogside. That's where people would bring instruments, on a summer's night. If the pubs were closed, that's where people would play. There's a really funny song that goes back generations called the Battle of Fox's Corner. Somebody throwing a trickle pie at somebody else, and somebody pulling a table and chairs out of a house and throwing them over someone's head. So it was like, you are now entering free dairy and the free dairy corner.
Right.
They're not important. It's not important because of the troubles. It became a site because it was already important.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And those were the kinds of things I wanted to try to get at in my book.
Well, you did it very well. One of the things we talked about, just touched on, was the idea of this majority Catholic population living in a minority ruling class. We hear a lot about gerrymandering in the US now and its impact on politics. And I really would like to hear your thoughts on gerrymandering that took place in Derry, especially in 1936, and how that impacted history.
When people sort of say, well, why did the Troubles start, or what happened, or what was the civil rights movement about in Northern Ireland, you often hear about jobs, votes, and housing, right? Mm-hmm. And in Derry, there was this really close connection between housing and voting. The thing is that the way voting rules were set up, they could be essentially orchestrated and administered at a local level. So who the people in power in the city corporation could essentially continue to dictate the ways in which voting would take place and how voting districts would be shaped. So right. The Derry City went through 4 major redistricting schemes over the course of 70 years. And those 4 major redistricting schemes were designed in order to continue to corral Catholic nationalist votes in one voting district. And so even though the city was majority Catholic and nationalist, because they were all represented in one district, or they would have minority small groups in the other districts, then they could never marshal enough political power right. within the municipality, and they could never send folks to Stormont in right. Belfast to represent them in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Which existed until 1972 and then has come back after the peace agreement. Right. So there was just this kind of, there were, if you were a renter, it would be challenging for you to be able to have a vote for some of that time. If you owned a business, then you would get 2 votes, right? You would have your householder vote and you would have your business vote. And there was a sense, certainly among Unionists and Protestants, that the people who built the economic engine of the city of Londonderry should be able to have a significant say, right? That what one brought economically to the city should be reflected in one's ability to have a political voice. Everyone knew that Catholics were the majority, but there were a lot of different kinds of arguments, like the one I just made, about why they shouldn't necessarily have parity of esteem when it came to voting. Right. And 1936, I think, was really fascinating to me because the Unionist majority in the city council designed these districts, and the districts were ridiculous, right? One literally went through, there was a school in one district and the entranceway to the school was in another district, right? The lines were so wiggly waggly and all over the place. So the nationalists were always kind of fighting back. And that's the other thing I love. Everyone sort of has this image in their head of Catholic nationalists in Northern Ireland kind of quietly whining about their lot in life from 1921 until the middle of the 1960s, and then waking up to this full-fledged civil rights movement out of whole cloth. Mm-hmm. And the Derry that I know through my study is a Derry where people were always fighting back, right? They just were losing. And so we don't necessarily hear about the losing battles when it comes to writing the histories. But so yeah, so the nationalists objected to this redistricting, and they actually got a tribunal, right? And they were more surprised than anyone that it went all the way to Westminster, right? And so English politicians and bureaucrats came to Derry to try to figure out what was going on with this redistricting scheme. And I think the reason I was telling you about it is because there were some minutes that I found of the Nationalist Registration Association, which was this voting, nationalist voting kind of lobby organization. And these guys were all sitting around the room, and they were talking about the Ulster Covenant, the Solemn Oath and Covenant. And that was this, it was a document, but it was also a spectacle. When Edward Carson was fighting against Home Rule and lobbying for Northern Ireland to be its own province and not to be subjected to whatever was going on in the south of the country, they wrote this statement basically saying, we will always be part of the United Kingdom. We are British and we don't want anything to do with the Republic. And it was called the Solemn Oath and Covenant. And some people signed it in blood. Like, it was a huge big deal. And people would come out, thousands of people. It was a family day. And the covenant was out there, and there was this very ceremonial signing of the covenant. And so these guys in Derry in 1936 were like sitting around the table trying to figure out what to do about the fact that like they still can't get a vote. And they said, hey, let's create a Derry nationalist version of the Solemn Oath and Covenant. And so they created this like thing, and it showed how many Catholics lived in Derry for each year, and then how many Catholic voters were, like how many people were allowed to vote each year. And, you know, they talked about whether or not they should have people come to St. Colum's Hall, which was the big kind of Catholic meeting space in the city. And ultimately, they didn't have a major event. They just went door to door, asking people to kind of back the Registration Association. But this way that like memory and history would tie into daily events and these smaller scale fights that you never hear about, but that ultimately played a part in the civil rights movement, certainly, that there needed to be a different means and method of attracting attention and support for the situation in Derry. And that to me seemed significant.
I remember when I went to Derry, I worked on a story about Foyle Women's Aid, which is a domestic violence organization in the city. And what was interesting about this organization is how it started, and essentially a group of 5 women who recognized that women who were suffering from domestic violence weren't being served, especially Catholic women who could not call the police. So they decided to throw a ladder up against the side of this abandoned building, climb in, became squatters, and much like your friend with the soup, people in the community came, brought them food, brought them clothing, and they established a domestic violence organization that exists today. I think that this is an example of kind of collective action addressing social issues that were really exacerbated by the political and religious conflict that was going on there. Can you think of other ways that you know, this kind of collective action really led to profound changes in how life was lived in Derry?
And Derry women are famous, I think, kind of globally, because for so many generations, they were working in the shirt factories and were primary breadwinners in the city. And a lot of times their husbands and their dads were taking a boat. You know, they called it the Scotch boat. It would go over to Scotland. They'd go to England. They'd work temporarily and come back. So that there's the sort of the idea of Derry women just being able to get things done. But dairy in general has this really long history of mutual aid and mutual support. And Paddy Bogside Doherty is a great example. Paddy Bogside, he used to talk about what he called the Up by Your Bootstraps Brigade.
Mm-hmm.
And, the dairy starting a credit union where people would put in their
Wow.
own money was just one example. John Hume was one of the folks who started the dairy credit union. There was also a dairy building society, and that was founded after the Second World War, where people knew that it was really hard for Catholics to just be able to show the economic stability to be able to get a mortgage, right? And in those days, mortgages were like 5 years; they weren't 30. So they started a building aid society where people could keep their money local in the nationalist community. And so those are like kind of two examples that I can think of. And one thing I just kind of want to say about that is that these mutual groups, these mutual aid groups, these informal organizations of people pitching in to try to help uplift the community, it was also a really important consciousness raiser for middle class, sort of better educated Catholic nationalists,
Right.
because when they started sort of like looking into issues like housing, when they started kind of trying to figure out why it was hard for people to either land a job or maintain a job, they started to see how the political situation and the sort of larger framework did impact people's opportunities and did shape and kind of restrain the constellation of possibilities that people had. And so I guess that's an argument that I make in the book. And not everyone's going to agree with it. And sometimes maybe I don't always like fully agree with it, but I certainly see events like the November 5th March, which was a month after the Duke Street March in 1968. I certainly see the Battle of the Bogside and Free Dairy, which was, it was a kind of, for several months, it was a no-go zone for police, and the Bogside sort of ran itself during 1969. I see that as part of dairy's history of people looking out for each other, supporting each other, and sort of acting like maybe, as non-Irish as it might sound, that words ultimately don't mean as much as deeds and actions.
Right.
And that we don't have to sit around all day talking about it. Let's just do something.
I've learned so much about a history I thought I knew, just from, this short time that we've had together. And I think that the really important point here is that, history is written by, as you've said, the person with the microphone. And you've done a great job of sharing the microphone with others whose history might not have been included in the mainstream history. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was a lot of fun and your questions were fantastic. Thank you.